like, does it say that like in the top corner?
Now it does. Yeah.
Perfect.
Good.
Okay, so I'm gonna open it.
Perfect.
And yeah. Hi, everyone. So right now it's 7 o'clock. We're going to just give it 2 more minutes for people to just come in if they're late. But thank you all for showing up. And please do not forget, ask any questions you have in the Q&A. We would love to answer them. All right, it is 7:02. We're gonna get started now. So let's get to it. So I want to welcome everyone here to Gen Z Jews Fighting Anti-Semitism Winter Speaker Series. Tonight's topic is an inclusive Jewish community and ensuring Jews of color are included and that their voices and experiences are heard. Gen Z Jews was founded to get Gen Z involved in a fight against anti-Semitism after the Tree of Life shooting, which was very personal to me. My grandma attended the Tree of Life synagogue and she lost a friend on that day. Recently, she said to me that you can't ask people to fight anti-Semitism if your community is not looking inward upon itself. So that's what we are going to do today. Today, we have an amazing speaker, Tema Smith. She is a diversity advocate, writer, and a Jewish community builder. She is currently the director of professional development at 18Doors, an organization that empowers people in interfaith relationships to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices. They also encourage Jewish communities to welcome these relationships. This comes after 7 years as a synagogue professional, most recently as the director of community engagement at Holy Blossom Temple, Toronto's oldest synagogue. Ms. Smith is also a contributing columnist at The Forward, whose writings have been published in My Jewish Learning, The Global Mail, and Canadian Jewish News. Ms. Smith is dedicated to building a meaningful and inclusive Jewish community through research, training, writing, and relational engagement work. I'm very excited, and I hope you are too, to learn from her tonight. Now, I'll turn it over to Ms. Smith.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm going to introduce you as well to Padma, my unruly puppy, who will be with me as long as he'll stay still because he's barking at the other dog otherwise. So yeah, so if you see like a puppy just appear in front of my face, that is what is going on. So I'm so glad to be here with you. And it's just so exciting for me to see such a really sort of dynamic program being led by young people, really trying to tackle some of these really pressing issues. And, I want to just start, I'm going to start just very quickly giving my sort of connection to the Tree of Life incident as well, which actually, Zach, I don't know that I shared with you, which is one of the victims who was murdered that day grew up at Holy Blossom Temple, where I was working at the time. And actually her daughter-in-law went on to found Two for Seder. And so we did a memorial program for her and built and planted a tree. But her cousin was our board president at that time. And I was actually in Japan when it happened and feeling very isolated from Jewish community. There's nothing better than waking up with jet lag in the middle of the night to that kind of news coming through on the phone and being completely alone in a foreign country where there are very few Jews to share that. So, it really was, I think, for so many people, just a real watershed moment and really starting to think about like, where are we and what do we do next? So it's really, you know, I guess like the best worst way to look at it is all of the really engaging initiatives that have come out after just trying to really solidify and build up our community from within. This that for me has been really rewarding to watch, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey, and then there will be questions that are open, but I'm just going to sort of try and set the stage a little bit about what including Jews of color means to me, and what it means and what I think it means to the Jewish people. So my mother is Ashkenazi Jew, white Ashkenazi Jew from Toronto. Grew up actually not far from where I'm sitting right now. And I'm in Toronto, and my father is a Black New Yorker, and they met in New York, and for all sorts of reasons, moved back to Toronto where they had me and my brother. And for all sorts of reasons, we didn't really do much Jewish stuff growing up, and there were many reasons for it. But some of those reasons were we were an interfaith family, which is how I got interested in doing that line of work, and we were an interracial family. And for us, there weren't families that looked like us in Jewish space. So what does that mean? It means that what Jewish community I connected through was really my family, and we had a small family. So it was my grandparents, and occasionally, we went to the Jewish neighborhood to the dairy restaurant. But like that to me was sort of what Jewish communal life looked like, was Saturday afternoons with my grandparents eating bagels. And we did holidays, but it was all sort of just very family driven. But I had a lot of questions about like, what does it mean to be Jewish and what does it mean to be in Jewish community? And there wasn't really a place to access that. Fast forward many years, as an adult, and I'll go into a little bit more about what it means to not have access to that. But fast forward many years, as an adult, I was studying religious studies, but essentially Jewish studies, just in a department that was called religious studies. And my school had modern Judaism and ancient Judaism and nothing in the middle. So they sent me to Israel for a year, to Hebrew University, to learn modern Hebrew, which we did not have. We had biblical Hebrew, not modern, all convoluted, but also to learn rabbinics, to learn medieval Judaism, and 18th century Judaism and all of that stuff. So here I find myself. It wasn't my first trip to Israel. I went on birthright. I was there once with my mom, actually right before I moved there. But I find myself with this community of mostly American Jews. There were Canadians also, but mostly American Jews who were doing Judaism so different, and it was so personal to them, and it wasn't something that I had ever accessed. And if you ever have the privilege of like spending that time, especially as a grad student, it's amazing because the people you're there with are the future rabbis. They're all there in their first year of rabbinical school, from HUC, from JTS, from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And so here I am, this kid I'm going to put him down and hope the barking doesn't start. Okay. This kid who, had very little connection to Jewish life, very little knowledge of Judaism. I could read Hebrew, but it was from academia. All of a sudden studying Maimonides next to people in rabbinical school. And I came back like, wow, I got to figure out how to do this for myself here, and started working to build community. What I found though, and so long story short, I come back to Toronto, I start volunteering, I end up getting a job in a Holocaust education project, then I worked in synagogues. And a lot of what drove me to make that move to synagogues though was like that feeling of, wow, there's this whole rich Jewish world that has so much meaning for so many people that like there weren't people like me part of. And what would it look like to build that? Fast forward 8 years, people are paying attention to that question now in a very different way than when I started, because and there go the dogs. Okay, I'm going to hope that they calm down because The little one is a little bit, he's 8 months old. He's very hyper. So what that has meant was, okay, hold on one second. And the puppy's back. Okay. What that had meant when I was a kid was, walking into synagogue spaces with my family, people looked at us, right? We stuck out. And I don't know about you, but if you walk into a new room where you don't know many people and everyone looks at you with a look on their face that says, I wonder what they're doing here. Or, a sort of concrete example, I don't remember this, but it's a story that my mother always told me. Was that we were out with my grandparents, as we went out with them every single Saturday. My brother and I would go during the day, and then either we would meet my parents for dinner, or we would have dinner with my grandparents and then go to my parents, and then they would come over for coffee every Saturday. And one of those weeks we were at a local Toronto dairy restaurant, if you know Toronto, United Bakers. So we're in there and we're walking, and somebody says loud enough that my grandfather heard, adopted. So, we were just open season to comment on by other families. And my grandfather yelled at this person because my grandfather had a bit of a temper. But that was sort of the atmosphere. And so when you're constantly sort of in that space, you have two choices. You either suck it up, which is not so much a comfortable thing to do, or you walk away. And the sad thing is, I hear about too many people walking away. And so when I end, so many and so much sort of misunderstanding of the experiences that we have. So some of the things that I always hear is people constantly asking people who they see who look racially not how they expected you to look. Oh, when did you convert? But for many of us, we were born Jewish, we were raised Jewish. And also it's not really anyone's business, even if somebody did convert, when they converted. That's a very personal question to ask someone in the first 5 minutes of meeting them. And just people constantly explaining or expecting explanations. Some of the other stuff that I hear that's really hard, and you can imagine people, and some of the moments that I would say are almost tensions with our fight against anti-Semitism, is you hear stories so often of people going to Jewish spaces that they're not familiar with or that they've never been to, and being questioned by security or by the police, who are this person doesn't belong here, and what the experience of that is like for somebody, especially, as we talk about race and racism in the United States, somebody who is, targeted by, or more likely to be targeted by police, they're likely to just stay away. And, I think, as I'm thinking about the community that I want to live in, and obviously I'm biased because it's the community I want to reflect me, but as a Jewish professional who thinks that there's a huge amount of meaning in Judaism, I don't want anyone feeling like they can't step into our spaces because they're not safe, because they're not, I should rephrase that, because I think a lot of us, we talked about Tree of Life. There's that's not the kind of not safe I'm talking about here. And also just want to add one thing there. I think one of the things that I hear a lot, and then we'll have loads of time for questions, so I'm just throwing a lot of stuff out there. But one of the things that I hear a lot is people will say things like, well, we can't talk about racism in the Jewish community because we still have to talk about, anti-Semitism is happening and we got to deal with that. And there's this complete forgetting of the fact that Jews of color all experience anti-Semitism too. So we're in that together. And what would it look like if actually all of us were able to put on a united front to fight anti-Semitism together? I have faced, I would say, equally as much anti-Semitism as I have anti-Black racism in the outside world. In the Jewish community, obviously, that's a little bit different. But, the reality is, though, some of the stuff that I hear quite frequently from Jews of color who I speak to is that feeling of being told that our concerns within our community are secondary to the fight against anti-Semitism. I happen to believe we can do both at the same time, and that we're actually going to be more successful at fighting anti-Semitism when we have a good enough sort of understanding and analysis of what is going on internally inside our community that might be sort of pushing people out, and we can build a better united community. So I sort of look at it from all of these lenses. There was one more thing that I wanted to say, but then the puppy distracted me. So maybe let's open it to questions, and then if I remember, I will say it.
So I've read in many places that people in communities of color are tired of the burden of explaining racial issues. So what's the best way to approach ensuring that there's an inclusive community while not putting this burden on Jews of color?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different ways that people feel that burden. One of them is that, like I mentioned, like you walk into a space and people want your story. That one's pretty simple, right? Like there really isn't a whole lot of, I mean, how many of you walk into a new room of people you don't know super well in a Jewish space and instantly have to explain how you're Jewish, right? So if we just treated everyone like we would treat somebody who we like instantly clock as Jewish, so much of it is about like, Jews are curious. I'm like, I know this, but so much of it is just not being able to sort of wrap your head around the fact that this person of color who has walked into the room is also Jewish. And like, it's like, oh, well, how did that happen? Kind of a thing. So that's one part of it. And that I think the burden there is a very different kind of burden, because that's just like feeling, it's that constantly, it's a constant feeling of being reminded that you don't quite belong. And that is exhausting. The other burden that people talk about a lot is the burden that falls to people that falls to people to explain racism in general. So, you know, we're not everyone's an educator, but we're all asked often to be educators and to tell people like, you know, as we're having conversations about what does it mean to be anti-racist or what does it mean to say Black Lives Matter or whatever, that people who are just expecting the, and in this case, I'm talking about Black people, the Black people in their lives to explain to them how they can do it better. And sometimes like I've been asked questions that would have been like, if you typed it into Google, it would have been the first search result. And I think some of the things that people have really tried to do is put out there, like, here's a resource list to get some of those basics answered. And I think, you know, people also expect a lot out of relationships that they have in ways that can make those relationships feel unequal, where, you know, the expectation is always on your friend who is Black to explain things to you, and to help you in some way, right? Because ultimately, when people are asking for an explanation, they're asking for help. And so it becomes this very unequal relationship. So, I mean, the biggest thing that I suggest is like, there's so much to read out there. There's so many great films, documentaries, everything that can really start to fill in the gaps. And, you know, I'm happy. I should have actually probably given you a few suggestions for reading, but I'll send you that later. But there are so many things out there that you can watch and read to sort of fill in the gaps of the history. You want to understand some of the terminology that people are throwing around. There are books that you can read or websites you can go to that have a glossary of racial equity language, and things like that. And then there are also people who do this, who educate, right? And I think when people ask me to come and talk, that's a very different thing than, you know, my friend asking me to explain racism, if that makes sense. Like, you know, some of us are in educator mode sometimes. You all are on social media. Tons of us are talking on social media. Seek out new voices. Like, there's so many ways to sort of find people who do educate, and not place it on the people who might be in your life. Another thing that I hear really often is like I'm going to be a little bit sort of sarcastic when I say this, but people are like realizing because of the way society is structured, we tend to live in fairly segregated communities. And so people will be like, wow, I don't have a black friend, and then they try and make a black friend. That's weird. Like, you can imagine, as Jews, I think we've all also experienced this. Like, wow, I don't know any Jews. Do you want to be my Jewish friend now? Can I come to Shabbos at your house? Like, it's weird. And unfortunately, that does happen. So just, being mindful of, like, yes, I think diversifying our friends groups is great, but doing it to have a black friend is just a strange thing. I hope that none of you do that. I'm sure none of you do, because so many of these things, I feel like because we are Jewish, we also have experience with. And so if we can sort of get good at tapping into how we feel when people do it to us, it might help us to not do it to other people.
And with all these like ideas that are passed around and kind of like thought of people who possibly don't look what you would consider Jewish, what do you think some of these prejudices are in the Jewish communities?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a bunch. We are, generally speaking, the Ashkenazi Jewish community is the majority Jewish community in North America, and we have certain stereotypes that kind of track to how you expect an Ashkenazi Jew to look. By the way, when I walk into a room, 95% of the time, no one asks me what I'm doing there, because, I've got white skin, curly hair, I wear glasses, and we have sort of these ideas in our head, both from reality, the people who are around us who are Jewish, and from books and television and everything else that portrays sort of this very typical Jew. When I do training at work, one of the slides that I show, I literally put in like Jewish family to Google image search, and it's all like white family sitting having Shabbos dinner, right? It's just like everything that you have. Okay, the puppy is asking for down again. Let's see how this goes. Okay. So we have these images in our head that are somewhat grounded in reality, right? I think that's important, is that the majority of Jews do kind of look like our stereotype of what a Jew looks like. Of course, that's not everyone, right? Even within sort of um like historical Jewish communities, even with Ashkenazi community, like there are people who don't have those stereotypical features. But one of the places where I think it's interesting to see how it shifts is that a lot of the time, the people who get asked instantly, if you ask somebody maybe who is white who converted, it's 50-50 whether they get asked like or looked at like they don't belong. If you ask a black person, it's almost always, unless somebody thinks that they look Ethiopian, or this is a thing that I've actually heard really frequently. Then you think because of our awareness of Ethiopian Jews, you see a black Jew and you ask them if they're Ethiopian, which is also weird. And so there's this sort of, we try and categorize it, and like we have this bucket that's like Jews look like this. Of course, that doesn't include um, some Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews. Like it definitely doesn't include like Yemenites. It does not include Ethiopian Jews. It doesn't include Indian Jews. It doesn't include Chinese Jews. Like all of these historical Jewish communities aren't included in that. And then also all of the people who have joined the Jewish community, either, mixed families like mine, or people who've converted along the way, or, historical communities that have been Jewish for centuries. And so it really is, I think it's like, I heard somebody describe it as a failure of imagination. And I kind of like that because it is. And I will say, like, for my part, because I grew up in like a white Ashkenazi Jewish community with like the Jews were all, my grandfather's family came from Ukraine, my mom's family came from or my grandma's family came from Poland. That's who I was around too. So like, I have had to very consciously, and I say this as somebody who is mixed, had to very consciously stop like tracking the other person in the room. I do it for probably a different reason. I'm like, oh yay, there's somebody else like me here. But like just being sort of aware of like, I'm still tracking and pointing out that person like somehow who might not necessarily want to be like in conversation with me based on their race. And so just being aware of, and that's like human nature to a degree, is like we look for similarities and difference. And it's just a question of, I'm not saying stop noticing it at all, but don't like approach somebody and be like, what are you doing here? One of the biggest things that I hear really often is like people get approached as if it's the first time they've ever been to a synagogue service ever, like in synagogues, which is the world that I come from, and they're like, yeah, I come to synagogue all the time. I just haven't been to yours before. You don't need to explain to me what a prayer book is. And that's sort of like, you can imagine if every time you walked into a new space, somebody did that to you, you probably would stop going.
Mhm. And with all of these prejudices and like ways of thinking that you're talking about, where do
Mhm.
you think they came from?
A bunch of different places. I think about this a lot, actually. I think some of it is the reality that we were a very insular people by not by circumstance in Europe, and um, suspicious of the world around us, again, for good reason. And so and then came to the US and Canada, assimilated to a certain degree, but ultimately have retained some of that sort of tribal connection. Like, I just think of, you're in a new city and like you see Chabad on the street and they ask you if you're Jewish and give you candles, right? Or ask you to rub tefillin. And like that is somewhat part of like the way that we still see each other in this like big world, is being Jewish is a point where we can connect anywhere with another person. And some of that again is by, when you're an oppressed people for a really long time, you build that connection with each other. Um, and like that's very 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 real. It's also the experience of being a minority, which we're a tiny minority in the countries that we live in outside of Israel. And so all of these things I think have built up a little bit of like a siege mentality, where we're like a little bit on edge about, we're always on edge about anti-Semitism always being a possibility, and like violent anti-Semitism being a possibility. So that leads us to be, I think, a little bit suspicious of people who we don't recognize as part of us. Um, and then because of the nature of just tying it back to American culture specifically, because of the nature of American racism that perceives Black people as potentially dangerous, that allows us to sort of take this anxiety and like in-group feeling and feel in danger by this person who looks like somebody we've been taught to think is dangerous. And so like all of those things kind of mash together to make, this isn't like easy, right? It's easy. This is unlearning like hundreds of years of understanding who we are and who's in and who's out. And humans are hardwired to think of like people in terms of in groups, and like in groups who are like us and groups who are not like us. Like that is part of the nature of how we function in the world. So there's like a whole bunch of different things that kind of all come together to make this a tricky situation. And I always say that, all of this conversation is a question of learning things and unlearning things, and we're doing both all the time.
So we have these prejudices in our communities, but how do we stop ourselves from acting upon them? And how do we stop it from growing more than it has?
Sure. So in terms of what we can do to stop ourselves, it's that learning and unlearning. It's being aware of ourselves, and being aware, and what that means, I think it means a lot of things. But one of the things that it means is understanding how racism functions in America, and being willing to sort of talk about the fact that The Jewish community was not insulated from the broader community, or from broader racist tendencies in the world. A lot of the time I hear this like idea that like, well, we're not like that, we're Jewish. And it's like, well, my colleague Alana Kaufman, who runs the Jews of Color initiative, said in a training, in a conference session I was in with her, it's not like we were in a Ziploc bag, right? Like we work, we socialize, we go to groceries, like we're part of American society. That's the reality. So understanding how it functions there. And then really taking that close look into the ways that we participate in various sort of aspects of race and racism. Like, for example, I mean, one of the big things that I always suggest to people is like, look at who's in your community and like who you're not seeing every day. Or if you do see, you know, I used to live in a heavily Jewish neighborhood. And in my neighborhood, I rarely saw Black people. And most of the Black people I saw were waiting for the bus, or like working in some of the stores. If I saw Filipino people, they were almost always people who were caregivers, or were waiting for the bus. So it was like everyone in the neighborhood kind of looked one way, except for a very small sort of group of people who looked a different way. And I moved to a different neighborhood, actually just one neighborhood over, and it's like totally different. And it's kind of mind blowing to me. So I think taking a look at some of those things. As far as stopping it from spreading, you know, we all have opportunities all the time to sort of course correct other people. And it's takes a lot of courage and practice. I'm not even great at it. And like, this is what I do for a living. But when it's in my personal life, it like is very anxiety provoking for me. I don't like confrontation. But saying like, hey, that comment might have missed the mark and have been really hurtful. Or, you know, I'll give you an example of a situation. A bunch of people were standing around. I was there. Somebody had just found out that I was mixed and was starting to tell me a story. She was from South Africa and was starting to tell me a story about how the Jewish women in South Africa straightened their hair so that they wouldn't be, this is in apartheid South Africa, so that no one would think that they were Black. And this is the story she chose to tell me like 5 minutes after finding out that I was mixed, which is a very strange story to choose to tell. And everyone around was uncomfortable. Like, it was so clear. Everyone was uncomfortable. Everyone knew it wasn't the right story. Nobody said anything. So for all she's concerned, she told a story that was totally fine. And it was even more complicated because I was at work. I was at the synagogue that I worked at, and she was a member. So like, it's like, that's complicated. I'm not in a position to be like, wow, that made me really uncomfortable. So when you hear things like that, like whether there's somebody there or it's, you know, you're at Shabbat dinner and somebody says something, learning enough about sort of the realities of how race and racism function, that you're able to sort of say like, something about that's not sitting right, and explain a little bit. And like, just, it's good practice, I think, to like just sort of be like, actually, that makes me uncomfortable. And it's not just about anti-Black racism, it's about all sorts of things. It's like about homophobia, and it's about, you know, any of the isms or phobias that are out there, to really get good at sort of feeling comfortable enough to say something. And it means so much, by the way, when I hear someone say something, or I know somebody is going to say something behind closed doors because they want to have that conversation privately. That actually means a lot to me. And when I think about the people who I trust, that my what I expect they would do in a situation like that actually factors in quite significantly. I'm going to give like a very fast example and then we can go to the next question. There was an incident in the local Facebook group in Toronto, where somebody posted an article that was about Jews of color and racism, and the comment section very quickly devolved to a lot of racism, which was not great. I tagged in the moderators of the group. They didn't do anything. Another Black Jewish professional tagged in the moderators of the group. They didn't do anything. 12 hours went by. Nothing happened. I decided that after 12 hours that I would go public about it. Then they deleted the whole article, like the article about racism. They deleted it with all the comments and posted like a very wishy-washy statement. The people who were racist are still in the group. The people who are Black left the group. I woke up the next morning to an email from my boss, who is not in Canada, right? I work in the US. And she said, I hope you don't mind. I sent this already. And it was a letter to the heads of this group, saying, like, this is the impact of that. And like being also vulnerable. She's like, I'm learning how to create a space where racism isn't left to fly, but like this is what happened. And that moment I actually cried. I told her I cried, because it was just such a, like, you can imagine, just she went out of her way, to something that has very little bearing on her, right? Like she was not a victim of the racism. She doesn't live in Canada, like all of these things, to actually say like, hey, as the head of a Jewish organization, I just want to point out to you, like, this is what's going on. And this is what the impact of that is. And I was just like, wow, this is a person who cares. And that was amazing. And so those are like the little things, is just like taking those steps.
Now, we have a great question in the chat. So, and don't forget to keep asking questions because we love to hear them and we love to answer them live. So, after Charlottesville and the past few years in general, the connections between white nationalism and anti-Semitism have become much more seen and understood. So, in your opinion, what impact has that had on the specific experiences of Jews of color?
Sure. So, I mean, some of it, so there's a handful of different things, that are sort of all related. One, obviously, we are all deeply impacted by both the anti-Semitism of the white nationalists and the anti-Black racism of the white nationalists. And so we're at risk on multiple fronts. They're not a fan of Black people either. And I think, some of the things that I think about that are really triggering, for Jews of color, specifically Black Jews, it's like we're triggered on multiple fronts. Not to say like the more triggers you have, the more triggered you are. That's not what I mean. But it's like different levers are being pulled all the time, right? And I think that's, thinking of the Capitol insurrection as a perfect example of that. There was the 6 million weren't enough t-shirts, and there was also the guy with the Confederate flag. And I was like, both of those things represent a genocide of one side of my family, right? Like that's or a wish to genocide one side of my family. Like that's the reality that we live in. So I think there's that. And I think there's also a growing understanding of like, you can't fight one without fighting the other, that I think has been really encouraging. At the same time, because the Jewish community is rightfully scared for our safety, some of those things that I mentioned before, like security, which, like, I've worked in synagogues for 7 years. Let me tell you, I always say to people who don't understand like why we have security, it was like, well, because the other, like, maybe you would understand if you were taught how to leave a building like safely, or spent all this time every time you're leaving the building looking over your shoulder to make sure there's no one there. Like, that's weird, and that's how we live as Jews. Like that's the reality. I was working at a Jewish organization when we got a government grant in Canada to put up like explosion proof glass. Like that's not a normal state of things, and that is normal in the Jewish community. So I think there's that piece of it. But what has happened is, because we are scared, people look for who's a threat. And because of everything I talked about before about like how America perceives threat, often that means either that people who are likely, like police who might make especially young Black men feel really uncomfortable, are at our communal spaces. And so young Black Jewish men might be feeling like, hey, they've actually lost the safety of their synagogue because of the risks, the real risks. And, I hear stories over and over and over again about security just questioning Black people coming into synagogue spaces. The irony is, and of course, we had what happened in New Jersey with the Hebrew Israelite people they're an extremist group as well. And just to explain one little thing that I think a lot of people don't know, the Hebrew Israelites are a giant group, not giant, they're very small, but like a broad range of belief. And the particular people who it was the school and supermarket, and then the Chabad house. Chabad house, not Chabad house. It was a synagogue. I can't even remember. This is terrible. There were so many in a row that I can't even remember. Were extremists, and I think people are like, oh, they're left wing. They're not. They're far right. They're separatists. They're Black nationalist separatists who actually parrot a lot of white supremacist language. And it's actually really fascinating. Same with Nation of Islam, by the way, far right. People don't seem to understand that. People are like, but they're left wing. They are not left wing. So just to sort of put that out there. But I think other than that, in that particular incident and some of what was going on in Brooklyn, which is very complicated, and there's not time to sort of unpack that today, because I could go on for like days about what's complicated in that situation. That is not an excuse. It's horrible. Like, it's just absolutely terrible. There's no justification for knockout attacks on anyone ever. But because of the way that we clock who's dangerous and who's likely to be dangerous, the Black people get stopped. Who has been shooting us more? The white people. And so these are some of the ways that racism plays itself out. So Black Jews end up being stuck in a weird place of not necessarily feeling safe to go into our spaces. At the same time that sometimes we actually really want our spaces because of these risks and because of sort of that general feeling. One other thing, though, that I want to mention is that because the conversation, though, about race and recognizing that Judaism is diverse and that there are Jews of color had started before all of this, in a very different way, I've seen that conversation of like, oh, yes, this is impacting people in a way that we might have not have clocked, rising to the surface in a very different way than it would have otherwise. And that gives me really great hope.
And do you think that the press reports on these situations, like regarding anti-Semitism towards Jews of color? And if not, why do you think that the press hasn't intervened or reported on this?
Sure. So, I mean, I think some of it is complicated. I think some of it is complicated by, I'm trying to, like, there isn't necessarily like a specific Jewish community of color where an anti-Semitic incident has happened. So like we face like, everyday anti-Semitism from all sectors of life. And, I think some of the stuff that we have been pushing the press and they've been doing a slightly better job on is that, if you're going to report on, say, this idea of Black anti-Semitism, which is in and of itself a complicated conversation, because why is there no such thing as white anti-Semitism? It's a little weird. Again, when we think of how racism sort of impacts things, it's just anti-Semitism. It just happens to be done by somebody Black this time. That what ends up happening sometimes is like Black Jews get impacted. Like, I mentioned the Nation of Islam already. The number of times I've been asked to disavow the Nation of Islam is like horrifying. They are, like I said, a far right group. They're homophobic, they're misogynist. They're actually now, Scientology is actually now their religion, which was a thing that I thought was a joke when somebody told me, but apparently it's true, which is all very strange. But, the story I grew up hearing about Nation of Islam was that they were behind the killing of Malcolm X after he tried to leave them. Like, that's how I grew. The joke in sort of many Black communities is when Farrakhan comes up, people are like, he's still alive. Like, and I think there's a big misunderstanding. And there's actually some great articles out there that explain like Adam Serwer, who writes for The Atlantic, wrote a really great piece about why he's a complicated figure and why sometimes you see people who you would rather not associate with him associating with him. So highly recommend that. It's a great piece. I don't have time to summarize it, but it's out there and it's phenomenal. Adam Serwer is a Black Jew, mixed race Black Jew. So, and he posts a lot of pictures of his cats on Twitter also. So if you like cats, go check him out. But he's, just very analytic about it. And so I think some of these things is like, we are then expected to answer for the anti-Semitism we face. The question was about the media. So we've been trying to encourage the media to sort of not tell that story in that way, that then sort of has backfire on us. But I think it's harder to cover like anti-Semitism that Jews of color specifically face because it's not really different than general anti-Semitism. I think, some of the things that media could potentially do different is if they're doing a story on the rise of anti-Semitism, make sure that they talk to a handful of Jews of color about if we're experiencing it, because generally speaking, if all Jews are, so are we, and things like that. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. At the same time, like, and this is all about like that sort of switch of understanding who's a Jew, that if you're thinking about who's the victim of anti-Semitism, you're probably going to go to your local federation, maybe the big synagogue, maybe the day school, and it's probably in response to a specific incident that happened. And that space might not be a space that has Jews of color in it because of all the things I talked about before. So it kind of self-propagates. So it's a little complicated. I've talked about anti-Semitism before in my writing, but I'm a columnist, right? Like I write my opinions, so which is a very nice thing to do, to just be able to like, they're essays. I'm not like they're essays, they're argued and with sources, but it's not the same as like a news story about anti-Semitism.
So how do you think these prejudices represent themselves differently or even similarly based on Jews in North America and Jews in Israel, where it is two different races or more than two?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I think always surprises people, if you don't follow Israel stuff very closely, the reality is that actually there are similar. So, not about who's a Jew and who's not a Jew, like not that piece of it, although that does play itself out. And like I can give you specific examples I've heard from North American Jews of color who have had racist things happen to them in Israel about as an example, during the asylum seeker crisis in Israel, a Black Jewish friend was told to go back to Africa more than once in her time there, and things like that. So those things are real and they happen. But I think the bigger thing is like some of the issues around structural racism, like what we see here, play out there as well. So I guess it was last summer, like summer 2019, there were actually huge Black Lives Matter protests after the police killed an unarmed Ethiopian Jew. And they shut down the main highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv for like half a day. And it was like a culmination of a lot of protests. And like, if you've spent any time in Israel, like just sort of clock where you see Ethiopians, they're often like the security guard outside the cafes and things like that. So there are structural inequalities there as well. So I think, some of those pieces play themselves out in very different and similar ways. Like it's like kind of both. At the same time, there is this culture of like, Jews come from all over the place in Israel that is very different. So you're not getting so often, like it's much less common that you're getting something like a Jew walking into a synagogue and being asked, like, what are you doing here in Israel? At the same time, my friends, multiple friends who have experienced things like that, they mentioned like go back to Africa kind of stuff. So it's kind of both at the same time, which isn't a very satisfying answer, but I guess is the reality, right? And I think we tend to like to make Israel simple, and it's a country like any other with its flaws, and its successes and its flaws. Like, heck, they've immunized half the country already. Like, what? It just popped up on my phone that like I think the New York Times are like they're looking at it as a study now in how to set policy for a country where like a large group of people is immunized and a large group is not. And now it's like anyhow, that's a tangent. But I think, we tend to look at those success stories and forget that like it's still a country of humans that are gonna make the same sort of missteps that humans everywhere do. And unfortunately, humans are racist uh, sometimes. And so, yeah, so I think it's really interesting in that sense to look at it. And like it really surprises people when I'm like, actually, there was a huge Black Lives Matter movement in Israel a year ago. Because unless you're reading the Israeli papers all the time, you didn't necessarily hear about it. And so I think that's when I think about some of the stuff I care about in Israel, and I care about many things, but one of them is looking at those structural inequities. And also there are also structural inequities towards Mizrahi Jews as well. So like it's a country, it's got its flaws. And so how part of what I wish I had more time to do, because I spend most of my time on North America, I wish I had more time to focus on Israel as well, but just I know it's there and I try and do my best to sort of address it where I can.
And so how can we achieve an inclusive Jewish community? And how can Gen Z lead in the progress towards this?
Sure. So Gen Z, I'm going to start with Gen Z, because Gen Z, one of the things that has been so exciting for me is, so I don't care if you know how old I am. I'm 37. I'll be 38 this year. And when I was growing up, there were no other mixed Jews around. Like, that's just reality. We didn't live in a heavily Jewish neighborhood, but that's also probably where the mixed Jews would have been. And now I look at people 10 years younger than me. So not even like the top end of, or I guess like not even the top end, like that's I'm Gen Y. Yeah, I guess it's the top end of Gen Z, is so much more diverse. And these are the people, the BBYO president was a Black Jew. Like, it's just happening. And that is like beautiful and exciting for me, who's now like approaching, my 40s, to look back and see like a community that looks nothing like the one that I did not feel represented in 10 years behind me. So whatever you all are doing, some of it you're already doing right. And I think some of it is also like you came up through Barack Obama's presidency and talking about race in very different ways. Black Lives Matter protests happened, in very different ways. And so the conversation about race looked very different when you were growing up. Like, just to put it in perspective, I was 17 when 9/11 happened, right? I was about to turn 18. It was like, I'm September 29th. So I was about to turn 18. So like that was my sort of watershed moment. And yours in many ways was probably Obama and Black Lives Matter in very different ways. I had the Iraq wars and 9/11. So it's a very different sort of society that you're coming up through in terms of that conversation about race. And just being reflective on that and being reflective of like, wow, like actually that's a really cool thing that's happened. Number one. Number two is, I think, really putting effort into continuing to learn and unlearn. This is something that is a lifelong process for all of us because like I said, we're hardwired to see difference and similarity. And so learning and unlearning is part of that. And I think the other piece is like, be advocates. One day, some of you may go on to be Jewish communal professionals or speak in Jewish spaces or get super involved in your Hillel or whatever it might be. Look around, and if you don't see Jews of color there, ask someone why. And I think, a lot of what is making this space more inclusive, making the spaces more inclusive, is the work of the people who walk into a room and say, something's not right here, there's somebody missing. And then even if it's like, okay, well, we don't know where to find the Jews of color, it hopefully switches on a light bulb for people to be like, okay, you're right, we're missing something, and just keep pushing that. And I think that's a very easy thing to do when we're aware. Some of us are automatically aware because we walk into a room and don't see anyone that looks like our families in that space. And, if you can sort of practice that awareness as well. And I think the last thing really is talk about it. like talk to, I mean, there's like the saying that racism isn't people of color's problem to solve, right? And what that really means is when people say that, if people of color could solve racism, we would have done it already, right? Like that's, I mean, once you think about it that way, it's like very obvious. Like, no, it really, we can't, it's not, we can't. So being part of the solution is being aware and pushing other people and just sort of keeping on it. And some of that stuff about like trying to, if you see something happening, like I mentioned, if you see something happening, not expecting the person who's being targeted to be the one to be like, that really wasn't an inappropriate comment. And like just that kind of, I guess, what they call allyship, just stepping up and sort of being aware. And a lot of it, and like I said before, like the more you practice it, the easier it gets. And the same goes for recognizing these things, that once you start seeing them, you will see them when they happen. So just keep practicing. And yeah.
And so do you have any parting words for everyone?
Good question. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. I spend a lot of my time training Jewish professionals, so it's very rare that I get to talk to even just like people that are not Jewish professionals, but definitely not Gen Z. So thank you for having me. And thank you for caring about this, right? You're taking time out of your Thursday night. And, you know, Zach approached me and said, do you want to talk about this? Like, you care. And like, for me, like I said, one of the biggest things that keeps me going is knowing, even if it's like two people, and it's more than two people here today, knowing that this topic is something that people are starting to really pay attention to and say, you're right, like we haven't always been 100% in our community, and how can we do better? So just keep showing up, keep asking questions, keep looking for voices, and keep pushing the people around you who might not be doing it yet, to do the same.
Thank you so much, Tema, for coming on today. And also thank you to our partner organizations who helped co-sponsor this event. Thank you to Combat Antisemitism and also Progressive Jews for co-sponsoring. But of course, thank you, Tema, for coming and speaking to us today about these very pressing issues in our community. So, and thank you everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you all. You can find me on social media. I am open. If questions come to you later, please don't hesitate to send me a note by email, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. Just tell me that you were here and I will do my best to write back quickly.
And so everyone, we have 2 more summits coming up in the near future, and just follow us on Instagram, Twitter. We have a YouTube channel now and Facebook, and we would love to have you all back at our next summits. Thank you so much for coming today.